All right. Hi, my name is Graham Johnstone. I'm a debater at Vestavia Hills, Alabama, and this is my second year debating. Okay, first, plans. Uh, if you're not familiar with what counterplans are, you should probably go watch the counterplan video first because plans are a bit more complex than counterplans. But essentially what plans are is plans are the affirmative version of what counterplans are. Like counterplans, they kind of specify a part of the resolution and way off and under that part of the resolution, but we'll get onto that later. So, parts of the plan. First is the plan text. The plan text is essentially like the modified resolution. What this means is that instead of saying, just for an example on last topic, in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory, you'd say something like, in Japan, voting ought to be compulsory because Japan is democracy. That's just a modified resolution. I'll get onto it though. Inherency. Inherency is kind of like an advantage, but it's the bad thing that's happening in the status quo. This is essentially like an advantage, just like diplomacy is collapsing or something like that, and like that's bad, and it hurts something else. And because diplomacy is collapsing, that's the reason to prefer the affirmative, I guess. Next is harms/solvency. Harms is essentially like the impact that the bad thing that we don't do on the advantage causes. Like say on one of last year's topic, there was a case that was just like in India, like in the Republic of India or something like that, then we ought to like remove nukes. And essentially what it was saying was just like in the status quo, which was the inherency, there is something bad happening that will in turn lead to the harms and will cause extinction. And the next part is probably the most major part of the plan, but it's the solvency. So it's what the affirmative, what the plan does specifically that will solve for the inherency and will solve for the harms. Essentially, if we do the solvency, then the harms should not occur. So, an example on the last topic, voting ought to be compulsory. An advantage would be that in Japan, voting ought to be compulsory. The inherency was that Japanese diplomacy is suffering, and in turn, Japanese democracy is suffering because there's this one-party state that's being completely dominated by a political group called the LDP. Essentially, what the LDP did was they were just like an anti-conservative, not anti-conservative, extremely conservative faction that dominated basically basically all of Japanese politics, and they really weren't doing a ton. The harms were that Japan wouldn't able to like check Chinese escalation. What this means was just that like the Chinese were going to like increase their influence in the region. It was going to lead to war between the United States and China, which would lead to nuclear war, which would lead to extinction. And essentially, what the solvency was saying was that increasing compulsory voting would overthrow this one-party state and increase anti-conservative policy and anti-conservative action in Japan. And essentially, what it meant would be like the Chinese would be checked when like they start to rise and start to like increase their bad influence in the region. Yeah, those are just the parts of the plan. But oh well, there's side note. These are just like side notes. But plans are unconditional, unlike counterplans, which some can be like dispositional, conditional, unconditional. And unlike counterplans, you can't perm them. Because like it's an affirmative argument. So plans can either be narrow or they could like broaden the resolution. It can be pretty abusive, but we'll talk about it later. Just another side note that I forgot to like specify. Plans usually like modify the act or the resolution. Like how I mentioned earlier, voting ought to be compulsory in Japan. Like instead of all democracies, it's Japan. This is just an example. This is the Japan app that I was talking about. So inherency, the advantage area. First, it says that Japan's democracy is collapsing, low voter turnout ensures a structural implosion, and this lack of Japanese participation decks Japan's soft power promotion agenda because it cedes all authority to the LDP, and restoring democratic participation is key. Again, the LDP, the one party state I mentioned, and the China part. China's rise is inevitable, but Japanese soft power diplomacy is key to preventing it from being militaristic. Increased Japan influence would also lead to deepening U.S. ties in the region. And the impact: U.S.-China war goes nuclear. Crisis mismanagement ensures conventional escalation, extinction. And thus the plan text. Plan in Japan, voting ought to be compulsory. Here's just a preempt because some people say that like Japan wasn't a democracy, which would make it extremely not topical. But this is the solvency advocate. Mandatory voting in Japan is key to reverse low voter turnout and prevent dictatorial rise through the strengthening of democratic legitimacy and norms. So this specifically says that the low voter turnout in Japan is occurring because compulsory voting isn't in place. If we put in compulsory voting, then it solves for the low voter turnout. And this is again just kind of a preempt, which is just like a preemption to an argument that like the neg might say. And counterplans can't solve the affirmative. Voters don't vote due to a lack of perceived opposition threats to the LDP. Compulsory voting forces their hand and flips against the LDP, which remobilizes the opposition. And here's just like framing mechanisms and stuff, which, you know, util. I like util. So yeah, I think that's plans. If you have any questions, just like email me or email Tempus or something.